Hello everybody. Even for those of us who know the brand, the sheer number of different variants of the 911 can often be quite confusing. But for a very, very long time, the wisdom of journalists has dictated that it is in fact the most basic entry-level Carrera 2, which is not just all the car that you need, it might in fact be the best of the bunch. So, after having recently driven a whole plethora of GT and turbo products, today I am behind the wheel of a plain old 997 generation 911 Carrera 2. And I'm going to be asking if, near 20 years after this car was launched, it's still the base model that is the one you should be buying. Now, don't forget kids, if today's review inspires you to head towards the classifieds in search of your perfect Porsche, to take CarVertical with you. The super-powered super search that cross-references a number of databases from around the globe to give you all the information you want to know on any potential used car purchase, including previous accident damage, potential mileage discrepancies, involvement in fire, theft, or, as unlikely as it might seem, usage as a taxi. It takes just 60 seconds, you need either a VIN or a registration number, and for 20% off the service, don't forget to use my discount code, JAYEMM. I think it's fair to say that as 911 generations go, the 997 likely had one of the best receptions of all. Its predecessor, the 996, took most of the flack for the change from air to water cooling, and it also introduced some rather controversial styling tweaks. Though technically speaking, this, the 997, is just a facelift of the 996. It was a fairly significant one. Not really in terms of mechanical changes, though there were a few we'll discuss shortly, but chiefly for its styling. Because here we saw a return to not just the classic oval headlights of 911s of basically every generation bar the 996, but also to that more broad-shouldered look, which really reached its peak with the old 993 and then disappeared for the 996, which in regular guise was a fairly flat-sided affair, and certainly has its own charm, and in of itself harks back to old 911s too. But I've got to say, there is something quite appealing about the look of a 997. And just in case you're wondering, it's not a small difference at the back, with this car having a rear that is some 3.5 inches, near 90 millimeters wider than the 996 C2. Big difference, and you notice it. In terms of the rest of the dimensions though, it's basically the same as the old one, meaning that on a country road with farm traffic about, it's easy to place, not at all intimidating, you have a great view of those classic 911 haunches, and this cabin is not really claustrophobic, but feels intimate. I love it. Though some of the hard points, like this beautifully weighted short throw and notchy gear lever, are in the same place as they would have been before, there are a whole raft of changes to the interior of the 997, meaning it feels not maybe just one generation newer than the 996, but possibly even two. Just about everything that you see or touch in here has been changed, and that really was necessary because the old 996, let's be honest here, I love that car, but the interior, well, it just wasn't good enough. However, what was always great about the 996 is the way that it drove, and with this being fundamentally the same chassis, that shouldn't really have changed. But as I've never driven a 997 C2 before, I suppose I should check that. Well, I am delighted to report that this is yet another excellent example of the 911. And what makes a 911 so special? Well, for me, it's always been the steering. With these cars having that massive rear weight bias, they're left with a relatively light front end, meaning that they don't need much power assistance for the steering, and so you get communication through that wheel at all times, but without needing to put too much effort in. Even at modest road speeds, I'm doing 45 miles an hour now, you can sense everything that the car is doing, and you just tip it into a corner with the most delicate of touches. It feeds back to you, and even at these low speeds, you feel that front end just nuzzling its way across the tarmac like a Stuttgartian truffle pig. And the reason that I wax lyrical so much about cars like this is that unfortunately, many of the modern generation of 911, well, they've begun to lose a little bit of that 911-ness. And this, I think, is simply a sacrifice on the altar of making them ever more capable cars. But on the road, this is already more than quick enough. And this is one reason why I think it's the regular plain old Carrera 2 that is the one that was often so celebrated. And as the whole point of today's video is to talk about the brilliance of the plain old Carrera 2, let's tell you a little bit more about it and the significance in this generation of the plain old Carrera 2. You see, for the 996, if you wanted yourself a regular Carrera, i.e. non-turbo or GT 911, your choice was Carrera 2, Carrera 4 or Carrera 4S. For the sake of argument, I'm going to ignore the Cabriolet and Targa models. There was no 996 Carrera 2S. Sometimes people are misled into thinking that there was, because what you see listed is in fact a car with the Tiptronic S gearbox, but the car itself, 996 C2S, does not exist. There was a 993 C2S, and rather interestingly, that car is actually slower than the C2 because it has the bigger, wider body of the turbo, but it has all of the power of a regular C2. And the same also could be said of the 996 C4S, which today is one of the most highly prized of the regular variants, but as for purists, well, it just doesn't make any sense because it carries extra weight, has no extra power, and therefore simply blunts the experience. But it does look really, really good though, with its nice big wide body shell. So, perhaps inspired by the success of the 996 C4S with the introduction of the 997 in 2004, Porsche gave us not just the C2, but also a C2S. However, for this one, they pulled out a few extra stops because for the first time in a long time, you could have your 911 with a selection of different engines. In the Carrera, it was a 3.6, effectively a reworked version of the same engine as you got in the old second generation 996. But for the S, they gave us a new just over 3.8 litre version of the same engine, making even more power. So here, in the regular car, it's 325 PS, and in the Carrera S, it's 360. Torque, meanwhile, is not quite as different, with this car making 273 pounds-feet, that's 370 newton-meters, and at the S, 295 pounds-feet, that's 400 newton-meters. In terms of the rest of the specification, there were also changes to things like the brakes, the suspension, and I believe in terms of standard spec, though I don't think anything significant. It's been a while, I can't really remember, and the fact is, with Porsche, a lot is optional, and now, 20 years later, much of what was optional in the first place might now have been retrofitted, including stuff like suspension, brakes, so on and so forth. So the differences today between a C2 and C2S may no longer be what they once were. In terms of this car, which has been brought to me by the lovely Guy, it's a 2005 C2 in this fairly plain looking silver over black interior, and the modifications are a 991 wheel, which I have to say does look much nicer than the slightly weird daft looking regular 997 one. It's also got a set of 997.2 19-inch wheels on it, which I really do quite like. And when a little while back a couple of the front springs cracked, he decided to move the car over to a Bilstein coilover setup, which he says he has now regretted because he feels like it has compromised the ride. He took it to Centre Gravity, who are my favourite suspension guys and real gurus when it comes to anything Porsche, and they've done what they can with it, but as far as he's concerned, it just doesn't ride like it should. Now, from my perspective, not having driven the car before, I would say it does feel a little bit bouncy and a little bit overly firm. I think moving to 18s for the wheels might be a cheaper way of fixing this. Alternatively, he is of a mind that maybe he should just move back to the OEM suspension. And I think there is a lot to be said for that, because I have driven a great number of 911s in many different configurations, both standard and modified. And more often than not, it is the OE setup which works the best. The final modification then made to this car is the fitment of a switchable sports exhaust, the brand of which we're not entirely certain, but we suspect it's a Dansk. And, with the valves shut, as I currently have it, makes a decent, nice noise, probably quite similar to that the car did when it was standard. However, press the little exhaust button down here, which Guy has retrofitted from a PSE equipped example, that's Porsche Sports Exhaust, and it takes on a whole different character. Now that's actually a noise that I can understand a few people not liking. It's quite guttural, it's quite raw, but I actually kind of like it. When we were doing the drive-bys earlier, we tried it with both exhaust valves shut and open, and the difference is stark. Having recently driven quite a few GT3s, it is interesting to note just how different a regular Carrera sounds, even with an exhaust, but it still sounds like a 911. You're never ever going to mistake it for anything else. Nor would you from this seat. This car drives beautifully. On the turn-in, there is just a tiny moment of inertia, but really not much even worth writing home about. The rest of it though, yeah, the suspension is a little bit too firm for my liking, but it's far from ruined. And the brakes, classic old school Porsche, they do need a bit of a shove before they start working, but once you get used to it, you realise there's actually a lot to be said for it being set up that way. Visibility naturally is absolutely excellent, its gearbox is fantastic, and the whole car does an awful lot right. Naturally, much of the ordinary day-to-day stuff is going to be exactly the same as just about every other 997 that I've driven. So the boot's an okay size, also has a weird little storage bin that I can't think I've spotted in many others, but it's there. The standard fit leather seats are beautiful. They are manually adjustable. You could also get electric ones, you can get sport seats, all sorts of stuff, but you know what? They're all good. Though at first it might not seem like a big deal, 997s also, I think through slightly subtle changes to the placement and the size of the steering wheel, the seats and so on, give you a lot more room around the wheel. Many 996s, it feels like they're trying to saw your leg off, particularly if you're chunky of thigh like myself. Naturally, in typical Porsche fashion, the pedals are set up absolutely perfectly for heel and toe, and the thing feels right at home on this kind of road. And I gotta admit, that old adage about driving a slow car fast is absolutely true. It is nice here having that little bit less power. It means that I can put my foot down harder and for longer and enjoy that wonderful symphony for just a little bit more. The back seats are then of moderate use. I think I'd see them more as extra storage. But what is different about this car compared with all the others I've driven? That's the engine. And the conventional wisdom dictates that the larger 3.8 is certainly the more capable, more powerful engine, but it's perhaps a little bit lazier, a little bit more about the mid-range rather than the top end. Whereas this is more about that fizzy, high-end, last 1,000 RPM, and so is the more sports car engine. Is that just journalistic guff though? Well, no, I don't think so at all. Now, as with every single sodding Porsche this era, it is geared quite long, with you able to do the national speed limit in second. But when you do put it in second, as I have now, you do realise that, first off, the car has oodles of grip. It's not too cold out there today. In fact, it's 12.5 degrees, which is quite warm for this time of year. It's dry too, but we do have a bit of muck on the road from the farmers. However, tyres on this thing are gargantuan, nice decent Michelins too. But the point I want to make here is that when you get that thing to about 5,000–6,000 RPM, certainly as you head towards that 7 and a bit thousand red line, it really does sing. Now, it's got plenty of mid-range shove. It certainly doesn't feel anemic, nothing of the sort. And let's remind ourselves, it is just a 200cc difference between the two engines. It's not gargantuan, it's not like a 3 litre versus a 4 litre. But to get the best from this, you do need to work it. It's at 4 where it really comes alive, and it's just a delight. And this amount of power, just over 300 horses, in a car that weighs, give or take, 1,400 to 1,500 kilos, depending on how you spec it, well, it's just right for a road car. And you know something? The last 3–4 months, I have driven about 4 GT3s. I've driven a GT4. Earlier in the year, I drove GT4 RS. I've driven a turbo. Heck, I've even driven a GT2 and the 911 ST. And they're all great cars, don't get me wrong. Some of them are incredible, maybe some of the best cars I've ever driven. But I can confirm that not only is this certainly not the poor relation, but that if it's road driving you're interested in, though it doesn't have quite that edge, quite that savagery, and that mighty high that you would get from a GT3, it's still bloomin' brilliant. And the best part? Well, guy paid for this car just £15. No, I don't mean 15 grand, I mean £15, because he won it in a competition, which is nice. Previously, he had a 996, which he bought as a project and did up. He also has a VW T2, which he rather loves, and I can totally understand that. But this he saw, thought, yeah, I'll have a go at that, and then, to his delight, he found out he'd won it. So the 996 went, and though he does miss it, he does also admit that this is a much nicer car to live with day to day. And if you have to buy your car like everybody else does, well, the price difference between a 996 and 997 is no longer what it once was. That is, I think, due in part to the fact the 997 is now the sort of awkward middle child. 996s today are viewed as a classic. This, though, well, it's not new, it's not old, it's just in that sort of awkward transitional phase. They also, I think maybe of all 911s, suffer the worst in terms of the reputation of their engine going pop. Now, this is specific to the 997.1. The .2 got the new DFI engine, and the problem there was more or less solved. But with these, failures are an issue. However, anecdotally, I hear more about it for the 3.8 Carrera S than I do the 3.6 Carrera. Now, that might just be because there are less of these. Today on Auto Trader, there are 65 Carrera 2s and 145 Carrera S. There is, though, far as I know, and I have spoken to the experts on this topic, Hartech, nothing about the Carrera's engine that makes it any less prone to this problem than the Carrera S. So if I were to buy one of these, I would definitely give preference to an engine that has had a rebuild, and if you could, get one from Hartech. Once you have had that, well, the engine problems of the car are no longer something you need to worry about, and though you will certainly pay a premium for a Hartech engined car, it's likely going to hold its money much, much better, and when it comes time to part with it, it will be a much easier sell. In spite of the fact the model is this year celebrating its second decade, yeah, kind of painful, that to think about. It's still a very nice and easy thing to live with. This one has had the Porsche PCCM Plus retrofitted, their classic nav system, which guy tells me is probably a bit overpriced, and he wonders if maybe he should have bought the £300 AliExpress one instead, that looks nearly the same, only has a bigger screen. But I think he's right to have gone the official Porsche route. I think it probably works a little bit better. Haven't tried the AliExpress one, can neither confirm nor deny, but it certainly looks a lot nicer in here than having, say, a retrofitted Pioneer, Alpine or Kenwood or whatever. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but whenever I see one of these cars with a system like that fitted in this day and age, it just looks a little bit naff. But in fairness, those systems are probably an awful lot better than any of the official solutions, and 10 years ago, the official solution didn't exist. So for most owners, well, they couldn't afford to sit around waiting. I certainly wouldn't refuse to buy a car on account of the presence of one. But one caveat I really do want to stress, these are a 2-decade or near 2-decade-old sports car, with many having fairly high mileage. Lots of them are over 100,000 miles, and I would have no qualms about buying a high mileage 997. But if you want the best from it, if you want it to drive and feel like it should, set aside a decent budget to go through the car, fix the bushes and things that may have worn. And doing that sort of stuff might seem fairly reasonable at the start, but once you've tallied up exactly how many parts you need, it can get expensive quickly. It'd be very, very easy for one of these cars to gobble up a couple of grand just refreshing a few bushes and nothing else. If the car's a little bit tired here and there, £5,000 to £10,000 could be gone before you know it. And so if you do want a car in good condition, it's generally going to be easier to buy one in the first place that's closer to what you want. Spend the extra up front, trust me, it'll be worth it. But the $1,000,000 question, how much are you going to pay to get into one of these compared with an S? And is it really worth getting the lesser model now? When they were new, of course, there was a big price difference. But today, there's not, with both of them starting somewhere in the high teens. In fact, if you're brave, there are examples of both the Carrera and the Carrera S for 15 grand. But I don't think even I would feel that brave. A good one, though, can still be had for under 20,000 quid. And though I think I would always be tempted to go for the S, the sensible money says get the regular Carrera. It's still a great driving car. It's got a slightly zingier engine, and because it is seen by many as the lesser car, I think for the same money, you should get something a little better, a little nicer, a little more well cared for, and that maybe has a better specification. And if I'm being entirely honest, I think maybe the best advice I could give to anybody thinking about buying a 997, don't think about it. Don't even consider whether it's an S or not. Just look for the car in the color combination, the specification, with the options that you want, and whichever one you wind up with, it's going to be a great car. So, there we have it. All that remains to be said is a big thank you to Guy, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.